culture wars, in as much as they were defined by guns, God, abortion, have really been pushed to the side. It's very much like, in some ways, like the early 30s, when there were all these different social movements popping up in response to the perception that the country was, headed downhill.
Welcome to the Miller Center Forum. Our guest today is George Packer. George Packer is an American journalist who's a staff writer for The New Yorker. He's published 8 books and plays, including 3 that we're going to use as sort of a launching pad for our discussion today. Blood of the Liberals, The Fight is for Democracy, and his newest book, Interesting Times, Writings from a Turbulent Decade, which collects 22 or 23 of his articles, most of which appeared in the New Yorker within the past few years, since 9/11. Please welcome George Packer. We're going to talk this morning about contemporary American politics, and we're going to particularly look at liberalism as it's defined and practiced in some quarters in the 21st century, and we'll draw upon these 3 Packer books. And before we sort of get into it, I'd like to introduce 2 people who, though absent, are very important actors in this story. The first is George Packer's maternal grandfather, who was Congressman George Huddleston from Alabama, who was a classic Southern liberal populist, served in the Congress for many years. His family had been slaveholders. And from grandfather Huddleston, George Packer inherited a certain set of views. And then George's own father, Herbert Packer, was a distinguished professor at Stanford Law School. He was the son of a Jewish immigrant who arrived in New York in steerage about the time that the Huddlestons were becoming populists. George, tell us about the views of your slave-holding Huddleston ancestors.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for bringing me here again. I think this is the 3rd time I've appeared here, and becoming almost a home away from home, especially now that I'm shacking up at George and Paige's house when I'm in Charlottesville.
We've given George his own key.
We'll see. They have. We'll see how long it lasts. Kind of makes me feel like I'm in high school again. Well, there are these 2 strands that are both strands of DNA that contributed to me, and also 2 strands that contributed to modern liberalism, and that are kind of embodied in the stories of my maternal grandfather and my father. My maternal grandfather was about as liberal on race as it was possible to be and still get elected in Alabama in the years between 1914 and 1936, which is to say, he voted against the anti-lynching law. But he said, he made, sort of liberal noises about the need for, civility and for the races to see their common interests, which to him were the interests of the working class. Because he was basically, as you say, a populist and a liberal, but back then that meant the kind of rhetoric coming out of his speeches on the floor of the House of Representatives was practically socialist. I mean, that truly did deserve the word socialist. I mean, if Glenn Beck could have heard the things my grandfather said, I think he might well have tried to get him arrested, because the rhetorical attacks on the big banks, the big corporations, the railroads, and their benefactors in Washington during the 20s, those were the staple of his politics. And he represented an industrial district, Birmingham, and his core constituents were coal miners, steel workers, farmers. And back then, they had a class consciousness, which meant that he could keep getting reelected, even though he did have perhaps milder views on race than many of them did, because he spoke and acted so passionately on behalf of what he considered to be the interests of the working class. Race had kind of been removed from Southern politics throughout his career by a constitutional convention in Alabama in 1901, which essentially wrote black Alabamians out of politics, basically reduced the black electorate down to a tiny, tiny fraction. And he left office long before the Montgomery bus boycott ignited the modern civil rights movement. So that was a period when race was submerged as a day-to-day factor in Southern politics. And that meant that class was the driving force in Southern politics. And my grandfather was on the left side of that conflict.
Now, your father experienced a different sort of racism, of prejudice. He entered Yale as a 16-year-old, the son of an immigrant, at a time when Yale had publicly announced that at something like 12% of the student body, they had too many Jews. Yeah, and yet he managed to be admitted as a 16-year-old.
The quotas were actually quite severe and quite, quite blatant. He came of age in the Roosevelt era, and so he grew up taking for granted what my grandfather's career had been all about, which was government intervening in a big way to create a sort of level playing field and a safety net, so that there was no longer the conditions of utter misery and poverty that my grandfather's constituents had lived in the late 19th and early 20th century. Ironically, my grandfather, at the end of his career, actually went down in flames fighting against the New Deal. And you might ask, how could a left-wing Southern congressman go against the New Deal? It showed you that his values were connected to an earlier era, an era that's very relevant right here where we are. Because he, in his most, in the fights of his life, he described himself as a Jeffersonian. And what that meant was he was against anything big, anything that threatened the little guy, any concentration of power that took away both the economic and political rights of yeomen and of workers. And to him, the New Deal was every bit as threatening as J.P. Morgan, because it concentrated power not in the hands of bankers, but in the hands of bureaucrats. And so, in a way, his career ended with a language that is now very familiar to us, which is the language of anti-government populism. My father came of age taking the New Deal for granted, thinking it was, thinking Roosevelt was the greatest president ever, and that was how I was raised too. And that's, I think you could say that's modern liberalism. Liberalism that accepts a larger role for government in the economic lives of ordinary people. And that has been contested throughout my adult life. That's going to bring us pretty close to the present, but just to give people a sense of what it's not as though these two strains of liberalism are neatly convergent. They're actually in tension with each other. Populist on the one hand and New Deal on the other. One of them kind of bottom up, based in a sympathy with the small businessman, with the employee, with the farmer. The other top down, seeing solutions coming from centralized power in government bureaucracies. They're not totally harmonious, and they've been kind of in tension with each other throughout, I think throughout the last century or so.
In one of your essays, you wrote that your father believed in unchecked liberty of thought, unbounded freedom of individual action, and all modes not hurtful to others. but also convictions as to what is right and wrong, useful and pernicious, deeply engraven on the feelings by early education and unanimity of sentiment, and so firmly grounded in reason and in the true exigencies of life that they shall not, like all former and present creeds, religious, ethical, and political, require to be periodically thrown off and replaced by others. That sounds almost like what a libertarian might argue.
It's close, but I think for him, that was entirely in the realm of the citizen and his relation to the state and law. In other words, he was a John Stuart Mill liberal who believed that, until it interferes with someone else's rights, that our political liberty should be infinite. But that doesn't mean that he extended it to the economic realm. I'm sure he's been dead a long time, and I was very small when he was alive, but I'm sure he would be all for a surtax on incomes above $250,000. Libertarianism now has become all about the economic interference of government in business. For my father, it was all about individual rights against, in the face of state power, having to do with political rights, social rights, but not economic rights. So that's another place where liberalism kind of parted ways with itself, and in some ways, people who thought they were liberal one day suddenly found that they were conservative the next.
The Fight is for Democracy is a collection of essays that you edited right after or shortly after 9/11. And in that, you attempt to make sense of the new world that was certainly started by 9/11. And you wrote, for at least a few dishonest decades, large numbers of Americans have been living in an untenable state, a kind of complacent fantasy in which the dollar is always strong, the stock market keeps going up, investments always provide a handsome return, wars are fought by other people, end quickly, and can be won with no tax increases, no civilian sacrifices, and few, if any, American casualties. Global dominance is maintained on the strength of technological and economic success without the taint or burden of an occupying empire. Power and wealth demand no responsibility, and history leaves Americans alone. Kind of pretty pessimistic.
Yeah, the 90s were supposed to be one of the great decades in our history. For me, they were a great disappointment. And I think in retrospect, you could say, when Bill Clinton was elected, some Democrats had the illusion that this was the end of the Reagan era. It was not the end of the Reagan era. In fact, the high watermark of the Reagan era was probably the congressional election of 1994. Bill Clinton was fighting a kind of rearguard action that may have mitigated, but certainly did not stop this tremendous move of American politics and society toward the free market. And that was also what the 90s were about. And to me, living during that time, I felt that it sort of trivialized everything. There was nothing large to believe in. There were no great causes. There was nothing that made you a citizen. We all had a free pass, and America sort of had a free pass, and imagine that we could have this tremendous economic power all around the world, and we're sort of in the face of people in cities that none of us have even heard of, and yet we expected never to be on the receiving end of any backlash or any resentment, or even to be responsible for it. So I found, for me, the 90s were a low, dishonest decade, to quote Auden. And his poem, September 1939, which that line comes from, became, a lot of people in New York were quoting it right after 9/11, because it had a lot of lines that eerily seemed to foreshadow what happened on 9/11. And you're quoting from a book, by the way, what George is doing, and I take full responsibility for everything I've written, but he's essentially kind of tracking things I've written over a period of maybe 15 years, and inevitably to hear it quoted back to me is a strange experience, because like, did I think that? Did I write that? So it's sort of a record of my thoughts at different moments, and no, I plead absolutely guilty to inconsistency, to self-contradiction. What was Whitman's famous line? Very well, then I contradict myself. And we'll get to more contradictions when we talk about interesting times. But it's almost the cost of writing candidly about what you're thinking at a given moment, that 5 years later it's going to seem preposterous.
Well, two pieces of the DNA that seem to come together are the need for self-discipline among the people, citizenship in the broadest sense, with all of its duties and obligations, as well as its rights and freedoms, civic engagement.
Yeah.
Has there been any change in that over the last 10 years?
Well, you're really getting at something that was deeply important to my grandfather, who really thought that he was an 18th century man living in the 20th century. He thought that everyone should, report to the to the capital, for 3 months a year and participate in government or something. And,
road building.
Yeah, the Tennessee Valley Authority, you name it. No, I think that 9/11 was a huge wasted opportunity. I mean, on that morning I was in New York, and but I wasn't near Ground Zero, so I actually saw it on TV like people elsewhere, and then tried to get close to it, that being my journalistic instinct, and was stopped at Canal Street, and that was as close as you could get, which was actually close enough to feel how gigantic this event was. And I had this thought that morning that seemed almost sacrosanct, but it was, maybe this will have a good effect. Because to me, it came like this gigantic slap in the face to this daydreaming country that I was describing during the decade leading up to 9/11, really between the end of the Cold War and 9/11. Thought it was a wake-up for our democracy. And I was aware that perhaps our leaders were not the ones I would have chosen to lead at that moment, but at that point, you didn't get to choose. And instead, very quickly, we were told, go shopping, do your duty as Americans, and Giuliani told people to go out to dinner and go to Broadway while we take care of it. And we, the people in power, will handle this. And the chance for calling on the citizenry to sacrifice something, to engage in one of these periodic American moments of self-improvement, which we do see throughout our history, it was lost. And so I think the book that sitting on the table, Interesting Times, is a record of the years between 9/11 and the election of Barack Obama, and it's essentially a record of a decade of wasted opportunities.
Steve Call and Larry Wright and others of your colleagues have talked about the importance of America's efforts to shape world opinion. You wrote that we're engaged in a war for world opinion, a war of ideas, and we're losing it. And we're losing it, you argued, because the ideals of freedom and equality, secularism, tolerance, and critical inquiry that have lain at the heart of the American experiment from the beginning now only get lip service from those in power. Much of the world, with some reason, sees America's commitment to them as shallow and hypocritical.
And that I wrote in 2002, when that process seemed to be just at its beginnings. We had a lot farther to fall in world opinion after that. But what strikes me from that passage is the tone, both those passages. I had this sense of urgency that we were in the middle of a crisis, an emergency. And for a writer who had spent a lot of my life studying American history, there was almost something exciting about being in the middle of an event you knew was a world historical event. I mean, I had grown up in the anticlimactic 70s, 80s, and 90s. There were no more world historical events except ones that happened in Berlin, for example. And this had happened a mile from my home, a couple miles from my home, and there was, I'm picking up my own sense of this is a moment to be seized, and I can see myself shaking the lapels of the government and the country. And it seems a bit hubristic in retrospect, and also it seems doomed because we were headed in a very different direction from the one I thought we should go in. For example, we had at the same time a government that was calling the country to a great struggle against an enemy every bit as vast in some ways as communism. That was the language, the Cold War language of the Bush administration. And at the same time, we were getting a huge tax cut, which just didn't convey to the country that they really meant what they said. And I think throughout the Bush years, he had the foreign policy of a kind of belligerent Woodrow Wilson and the domestic policy of Benjamin Harrison or William McKinley. So the two were completely at odds with each other. The status quo at home, a kind of stagnant, not particularly imaginative, all these problems festering that went unattended, and overseas this rhetorical, overblown kind of calling to arms that ended up making people very cynical, both people at home and people abroad, and I think contributed to the election of 2008.
Now, a lot of people think that the election of 2008 was one of these historic turning points in our history. What's your take?
I think it still remains to be seen. It's true that on that night and in the weeks before, when it was clear that that was the direction things were, and after, for me, I mean, the fact that the first black president had just been elected was it was just unbelievably thrilling. But to me, that was not what was going to be most historic about it, if it would be. I thought that would be a great landmark that would then almost be forgotten. And I think Obama wanted it to be forgotten pretty quickly. He has certainly not made that a key part of his politics. He has downplayed it all the time. For me, the real question was whether it would be a turn away from the free market ideology that has been dominant throughout my adult life and back toward some new version of the activist, interventionist liberalism of Roosevelt. And I think we don't know yet, but it's my sense of how realigning the election might be has diminished in the year that Obama's been in power. I expected it to be a more dramatic break with the past than it's been.
Well, in one of your essays, you wrote that, and this was, I believe, written shortly after the election, that most great transformative presidents have been driven by, or at least supported by, a large social movement.
Yeah.
Lincoln with the abolitionists, Roosevelt with labor unions and the national emergency, Johnson with the civil rights movement, Reagan with not only a renewed interest in sort of the Goldwater conservatism, but also the religious right.
The religious right and the anti-tax movement together created
Reaganism.
the conservative movement that brought Reagan to power.
And is there a comparable movement? I mean, what is it that generated this outpouring of enthusiasm, new voters, young voters, and so on for Obama? Was there any social movement there, or was it really sort of the uniqueness of let's elect a black man president?
I think it really was not a coherent social movement of the kind that's going to sustain a president once he's in power. And we've seen that. What happened to the 10 million strong internet campaign that was so revolutionary in 2008? Why hasn't that campaign been able to support the president's legislative initiatives in a way that has gained traction in Congress? I think it's because it didn't have a truly organic, kind of from the bottom up vision of what it wanted that was as both broad and as specific as anti-tax or pro-civil rights, which were the two most recent really big social movements that enabled presidents to do things. Instead, it was, I think, partly the excitement of the man. It was about getting him elected. And they achieved that goal, and a lot of them seem to have decided that that was really all that they'd ever wanted to do. And I think in some ways conservatives are more serious about their policy goals, because if it had been a conservative movement that elected a conservative president, I don't think they would have gone home after getting him elected. But instead, maybe the expectations were so high, partly because these were mostly young supporters, and as soon as compromises and business as usual returned to Washington, which was inevitable, people began to get disillusioned. Well, politics is always disillusioning. You don't let that drive you out of the arena. For these reasons, I think maybe Obama himself has been somewhat at fault. He has governed, he reminds me more than anything of a kind of early 20th century progressive. One of these educated, high-minded believers in duty, in citizenship, in the public good, but not really in interest groups, whether it's labor or civil rights or any other interest group, kind of rising above the factions that are always competing for the ear of people in power. Instead, I think he believes in expertise and in letting the best people sit in a room and thrash out the problems of the day and come up with answers. And then the answers and the good effects that follow will persuade the public that this was the right thing to do. He has lost his persuasive power, which he had during the campaign. And I think it's because the real Obama was not a messianic, inspiring figure who moved millions. I mean, I think he put on that mantle because it carried him to the White House. But the real Obama is an intellectual who is most comfortable in a small room with a small group of expert advisors, figuring out on the merits what is the best thing to do. And whenever someone brings him a problem, this is something I heard recently from a Democratic politician, if you want Obama to do what you want, the best way is to tell him, Mr. President, this is the unpopular thing, and it's the difficult thing, but it's also the right thing. He'll do it. If you tell him, Mr. President, the experts actually think that this is demagogic and grossly political, but it will certainly help your reelection prospects, forget it. He'll kick you out of the office. So this is a bit of a dangerous way to govern in a time of great volatility and passion and anger and skepticism in the electorate. I think what I've learned from the past year is there was an openness to government being more part of the solution in the election of Obama, but it was an openness that was very narrow and that was ready to shut down with a deeply ingrained skepticism that has been decades in the making. And it's shutting down, and partly because Obama has not kept it open, because he hasn't been a Roosevelt-like leader who wants to draw bright lines and say, which side are you on? And if you want to fight, I'll give you a fight. That's not Obama's style, and that is his opponent's style. So in a way, they've kind of had an easy time of it with him.
George, William F. Buckley famously said that he would rather be governed by the first 2,000 names in the Cambridge phone book than by the Harvard faculty. And you seem to be suggesting that Obama would like to get the Harvard faculty or some equivalent.
Look who's around him. Yes.
It is a very sanitized presidency. He has tried to not get down and play in the muck with the Congress on health care, on regulation of the banks. He's tried to sort of stay above the fray and let them be the ones to get in there and wade in. What does he need to do in order to get the power back?
The question is, what can he do within the parameters of his own character? Because my guess is his political advisors are urging him to use words like fight. And that's a word that he used something like 30 times the other day in an appearance in Ohio. And I think they're gonna send him out to Ohio. I wouldn't be surprised if he comes right here to the 5th District in Virginia and to other battlegrounds. And my guess is he will start talking more about the big banks and about, the shame of Wall Street, language that my grandfather would have been extremely comfortable with, and call out the bankers by name, and tell the Republicans, if you're against the bailouts, then why are you voting against my financial regulatory reform? And draw lines that are less about a government program that might change the lives of millions of people, and more about preventing big business, big oil, big banks from continuing, big insurance companies, from it continuing to dominate the lives of ordinary people. He's going to draw the line not between government and business, but between business and the mass of Americans. Now the question is, two things about that. One, will it work? Will people think that's really who Obama is, and I'm glad to hear it? Or will they think there's something opportunistic about this language? It's not the language we heard during the bailout, for example. It's not language that comes easily from the lips of Timothy Geithner or Lawrence Summers, or maybe Barack Obama, who I think, for all of his visionary qualities, is in many ways a conservative figure. He is not anti-institutional. He is not comfortable stirring up outrage at core institutions. I think he wants to make those institutions work, and he's done that at the expense of his own political well-being. So that's the first question: will people buy it? And the second, if that's what he does indeed, and I think he will. And the second is, what will then be the legacy of the big reforms that he spent his first year trying to push through: healthcare, climate change, and others? And it may well be that we're going to hear less and less about those. And if so, I think he will already have essentially yielded the key ground to his opponents. I'm hearing from the White House that no, we're going to keep fighting those fights, but we'll see. We'll know in the next few weeks.
So Obama after 2010 could be Clinton after 1994.
Sure feels like 1994 right now.
George, many of us who are interested in politics got very accustomed to thinking about the axis of polarization in the nation along the lines of UVA's James Hunter's book, Culture Wars, the orthodox, the religious right versus the progressivist, the secular left. It seems as though in the last year or so, that axis has fundamentally shifted, moved over to the Tea Party movement. I wonder if you could comment on whether you think that's true, and if so, what really is motivating the Tea Party people and the passionate, so rapid turn away from Obama?
Well, I'm not sure it's been so rapid and so complete, the turn away. I mean, polls show he's still about as popular as Clinton and Reagan were at this point in their presidencies. We forget that Reagan went through, a huge recession. The election of '84 has kind of wiped the slate clean on how unpopular Reagan was in his first couple years. I think what Reagan did that Obama has not done is, even when he was really unpopular, Reagan continued to enunciate a few very simple, very potent points of principle, so that people really knew that there was a bright line and that he was on one side of it. That's something Obama really doesn't like to do, but that's just an aside looking back at history. Anyone who thought 2008 was the Democratic version of 1980, I think, has found that Obama is not the Democratic version of Reagan. I think you're right that the culture wars, in as much as they were defined by guns, God, abortion, have really been pushed to the side, and the key issues for the Tea Party movement are all about government. I interviewed some of them around here. I can't say I've really done it broadly enough to know what animates them. My guess is it's really a lot of very disparate kinds of people and kinds of social forces. Libertarians, conservative Christians, pissed off people. And, it's like a wildfire. It's very much like, in some ways, like the early 30s, when there were all these different social movements popping up in response to the perception that the country was, headed downhill. And some of them were, like the Townsend movement for old age pensions led to Social Security. Others were purely destructive, like Father Coughlin, who ended up essentially, being a fascist. The Tea Party movement seems purely destructive to me right now. I don't see any positive agenda for truly confronting problems. I interviewed Lawrence Verga I've been doing some reporting here in the 5th District, and I interviewed Lawrence Verga, who sort of tried to grab the Tea Party movement as his own. And his interpretation of the past few years is that business has been entirely blameless, and it's only been when government gets involved in business that we have economic problems, which to me it's such a bizarre reading of the causes of the financial crisis that it's kind of hard to figure out, well, where does that leave you? How do you solve problems if those are your premises? I don't think the Tea Party movement has had to figure out what it's for, because they're against, and it's quite destructive in some ways. But to me, what it mostly represents is deep unhappiness with the economy, with society, with government, probably going well beyond Obama's first year. And it's a dangerous force, but it's also a real force. And Roosevelt knew how to both check it and tap it, channel it. He kept Huey Long from, becoming so powerful that the populist forces could actually have threatened Roosevelt's presidency, partly by co-opting some of Huey Long's mess. Obama is not checking and channeling that rage, which is like a wildfire, and which could go in a lot of different directions depending on the wind. Instead, I think it's begun to consume him, because he's not comfortable with populist politics, and we're in an age of populist politics. That's why I think, in some ways, he seemed like just the right man in 2008. His high-mindedness, his articulateness, coming after many years of low politics and inarticulate, public discourse. His honesty, his obvious intellectual qualities. But things have have beyond that now, and it's as though I'm not sure his character any longer is capable of controlling the social forces that have been unleashed.
My name is Al Reynolds, and I'm be interested to hear your thoughts on the recent Supreme Court decision about the role of campaign of corporations to finance future politics.
Right. Well, believe me, I'm not a constitutional scholar. I can't really pronounce on the legal reasoning behind it. But what is striking is how dramatically it seems to break with the supposed judicial philosophy of the majority of the court, which is respect for precedent, don't legislate from the bench. As Justice Roberts said during his confirmation hearings, a Supreme Court justice is essentially an umpire calling balls and strikes. And this decision, actually got up to the plate and hit a home run on behalf of organized money. And so it seems if Bush v. Gore hadn't already sort of put to rest the question of whether there were justices who actually were deciding cases independent of their political interests, this decision should put that to rest. We have a politicized court, we have a polarized court, and it reflects the country. And it's one more institution that I think the public is going to lose faith in if they haven't already, because if you go across the board of our institutions, not just government, business, finance, the media, you see a kind of short-sightedness, self-interestedness, a lack of real, intellectual rigor, and it makes people cynical. I think this decision is going to make people very cynical. Even people who are happy with it are going to become cynical because it's going to seem like a decision that was made in their favor. That makes people cynical just as much as decisions made against you, because it seems to be a decision of favor. And that was, by the way, the position the Supreme Court was in the late 19th century, when it kept striking down any attempt to regulate the economy, and it partly led to the progressive era and the New Deal.
That's right. Lochner sort of ushered in the progressive era.
Exactly.
My name is Betty Mooney, and I guess my question is, I'm personally more hopeful about Obama than I think I'm hearing you. And in the previous election, as Democrats and liberals, we heard a lot about framing the issue. And I have several relatives up in Washington who work in agencies up there, and we had a discussion this weekend, and I wonder what you think of this. So many of his policies and what he's trying to do are to help the people that your grandfather represented. But the way it's being framed right now is all these people, and what I feel are his strongest constituencies, are the working class, and they're very worried about their jobs. And the young people are very worried about getting jobs. And I feel that so much of maybe the health care, the regulations, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, these are regulations that actually may lose jobs in some fields. Mm-hmm. And I wonder about, maybe we need to get back, or he needs to get back to the campaigning Obama that we saw, and really stick to this issue of jobs and the economy first.
Well, he campaigned on health care reform. I mean, I remember one of the debates between Obama and McCain, and health care was discussed for maybe half an hour or 45 minutes. I mean, I think it was one of the 2 or 3 top promises that he made. And back then, polls showed that people desperately wanted health care reform because they understood that it was part of what was dragging down their personal economic well-being and costing them more money than they could afford, costing businesses more money than they could afford. Business seemed to have finally come around to the need for a kind of universal health care reform. And it's only been in the months in which it's actually been debated and voted on that people have turned against it. And what that says to me is maybe it's about framing partly. I do think Obama has forgotten the persuasive imperative of the presidency. I think he's been too comfortable with the internal deliberations as the be-all and end-all, and has forgotten that he has to keep telling the public what he's doing in a few simple terms that Reagan was able to do. But I also think we're learning something about the public and about the media, which is that we're fickle, we are to some degree irresponsible. We want it, but we don't want to pay for it. We want it, but we don't want to see the ugly process by which it's going to be enacted in Congress. We want it, but we don't want to see any compromises made about it. And so as it's lost one constituency after another because of the inevitable, process of legislation, which Obama, you're right, he has stepped back and allowed that to be front and center. Well, Social Security had an extremely ugly fight back in 1935, and was, businesses were bitterly opposed, and so were some newspapers. And yet the public seemed more capable of seeing a long-term necessity and benefit in spite of short-term pain. Now, I don't know if the public is so ready to sacrifice and to see it done in the ugly, messy way of democracy. Instead, everyone is a purist, and everyone wants, and everyone is also a talking head. This is something I noticed during the campaign. I was reporting in southeastern Ohio, which is Appalachia, and everyone sounded like last night's cable news show because everyone was watching Fox or MSNBC and had kind of absorbed the talking points coming down from the anchors who had probably received it, from some party operative. And it struck me that, it was as if people were ignoring whatever experience in their own lives was telling them in favor of what the guys on TV were telling them. The power of cable news is also a new thing, and it is not a thing that is pushing toward patience and taking responsibility. Instead, it's pushing toward glorifying conflict, drawing lines, and having, fights to the death. And so I blame us. I mean, I blame the public and the media for the fact that Obama has tried to do what he said he was going to do, what everyone knew he was going to do, and has, received, disastrous reviews for. I blame Obama a little bit, but I really blame us.
Well, we're an ADD nation whose greatest pleasure, particularly with young people, seems to be playing video games.
That's a crueler image than I was ready to embrace, but let me think about it. I'll let you know.
My name is Rich Collins. Thank you for coming. I very much enjoyed the session with George's questions. The one thing that strikes me is that it's much too early to know what Obama is ultimately going to become, even in one term.
Yep.
As everybody remembers, there were two New Deals, really. One and then a second one that were quite different. But my question to you is really revolves around the words you've used: progressivism, populism, liberalism, a New Deal sort of thing. We don't have a word for what we're in, obviously, or any term for it, and we use all these terms without anyone really understanding. My question, do you think that it's part of the clarity of populism, for example, or even progressivism, was the world seemed more understandable, that we knew what banks were like, we knew how money was made, or they did have a clearer, perhaps more primitive notion. Right now, I don't think people have a clue as to how to even read the Wall Street Journal. And I wonder if you think the complications that come out of modern economic teachings, as well as the desire of the Wall Street Journal to spin printing money as fiscal loosening or something, I'd be interested in your reaction.
I think that's a great point. I have been using those isms as if we all know what they mean, and perhaps historically we did know what they meant. The one ism that still seems to have complete understanding and currency is conservatism. But I think it's in a way an easier ism to live by today. And that is for maybe precisely the reason you just laid out, that conservatism is essentially against these efforts to solve problems, to use government in order to address long-term social problems like the decline of the middle class, the burden of health care, and the fate of the planet. And so it may well be that in the midst of all the complexity, for example, just today I was reading an article about Obama's latest plan to limit the risks that big banks can take. I had to read that pretty carefully to know what even remotely what they were discussing. I mean, they're probably, the majority of you are better versed in economics than I am, but nonetheless, who even knew what mortgage-backed securities were until you found out that they were destroying, the national economy? All of that complexity of the economy of life, the pace of change, which is so dramatic, I think all of that does make people want to say no, say, I'm not buying it. You're telling me that we can tinker with this and subsidize that and regulate insurance over here and support, working class people's need for health insurance and have a mandate but have these exceptions to the mandate. Stop. This isn't going to work. It's way too complicated. I don't believe it can happen. I haven't seen it happen in my lifetime. Government hasn't done anything big since 1965. Why should I believe it? So it's both the complexity and the deep suspicion that is partly a result of the complexity leaves one ism standing, and it's not liberalism. So it is a very hard case to make today, in spite of the fact that everyone knows these problems are real, they're deep, they are going to get worse, and getting out of the way is not going to solve them, because actually that was the policy of the last administration, and it didn't seem to have worked very well.
Good morning. My name is Phil Williams. Mr. Packer, my question to you is, it seems like much of your presentation is sort of a continuum with big government at one end and big business at the other, and a bewildered population in a vortex in the middle of it. And it seems as though a lot of the commentary addresses the excesses of one end of the continuum, big business. Could you address the possible excesses of the other end of that continuum, keeping in mind things like Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, their management, the compensation, looking at particular deals being done for the people, namely people, organized labor, or deals that were done in Nebraska or Louisiana, because I think a certain amount of cynicism can come out, can be derived just as easily from overweening tendencies of big government as for overweening tendencies of big business. Thank you.
I think that's absolutely right, but you have to look at the kind of big government we've had, especially over the last decade. George Bush presided over big government. We all know that. But in retrospect, it was the kind of big government that William McKinley presided over, which is why I said in domestic policy he was a McKinley. In other words, a government that enabled big business, gave it breaks, gave it subsidies, created policies in secret that benefited oil companies, for example, and that essentially created a huge boom in the financial sector and in other sectors, while in the past 10 years, average incomes actually declined, which is a very rare thing in American history. How could we have a booming economy and average incomes declining? It was almost, for Alan Greenspan, this was such a shock to his worldview that he said, I was mistaken. I thought that if you got government out of the way, that people would do the rational thing. Well, it turned out that they might actually blow themselves up. So I don't think that what we are seeing is big government in the sense of new programs with universal mandates. The only one that Bush created was the prescription drug benefit, which helped the pharmaceutical companies as much as it helped senior citizens. What we're seeing is big government that is essentially corporatist, and that becomes an arm of big business. And that's neither populist nor progressive. That is a familiar thing from American history, but it is not a reforming big government. It's a big government that is consolidating economic power. And so that's why I think a line of argument today that is potent is not for necessarily big government to create new programs, but big government to defend small entrepreneurs, small businessmen, and ordinary people from both the corruption of Washington and the corruption of Wall Street. The party that can talk that talk and turn it into serious policy, I think will have a big advantage. But right now, each party seems to have lined up on one side or the other, or both sides at once, without actually meaning what they say about, big is bad. So I take your point, but I also don't really think we've been living through anything like, a New Deal style big government in the past 10 years. It's been a different kind.
Hi, my name is Bob Warner. Thank you for coming and presenting again. I wanted to go back to healthcare, and I want to cite, although many people, I want to cite Nate Silver at 538.com, but many people have written on what he's talking about, and that's on the lies on healthcare. And what he says and what I read, and I've seen other places, that when people actually understand what the proposals in the healthcare bill will do for them, they're all for the proposals in the healthcare bill. And yet, in my personal opinion, at least in the previous administration, I saw what Joseph Goebbels called be sure you tell a giant lie, because the little lie would be recognized, and tell it over and over and over and over and over ad nauseum. And I believe that has continued with the healthcare debate. I believe it was used to justify some of our wars and other things. But what can be, the people I believe would be most helped by healthcare reform, in many cases, are those most persuaded by what, in my opinion, is the big lie told over and over with the millions of dollars, which are going to be even more after the Supreme Court. So do you have any thoughts? I mean, if the big lie has persuaded people to act against their own self-interest, can Obama, or even maybe in the media sometimes, tell the truth over and over and over to counter the big lie, which seems to be persuasive?
You know, I don't really, I think there's a little bit of truth to what you say, but I don't really share the premise, which is that people are fooled again and again and keep failing to act in their own interest because they swallow lies. That's the theme of a book called What's the Matter with Kansas, which sort of asks the question, why is it that people in Kansas keep voting for the party that seems to be making Kansas poorer and poorer? I think people have more of a sense of their own values and interests than that. They're not quite so plastic and malleable. I think instead what's happened is there are things in the healthcare bill that frighten people, like the mandate. A mandate seems very close to being, to setting up some sort of federal police force that's going to go around asking people if they have health insurance, and if they don't, who knows what. Anything that's a mandate that is coercive alarms a lot of people. The cost of it alarms people. The size of it, the 2,000 pages of it alarms people. There are reasons why it's been relatively easy, I think, for its opponents to turn a lot of Americans against the bill. I'm not saying that those reasons are the right ones on the merits. It may well be that you have to have a mandate, or else costs will never go down, and people will opt out of the system, and premiums will continue to rise. So, I mean, as I guess Paul Krugman has written recently, you can't reform healthcare piecemeal, because if you just attend to, regulation and, pre-existing conditions, then you're going to have premiums going up if you don't do something about that too. It's very complicated, and I think the likelier explanation is not that people are being conned, but that people are feeling their own disbelief that anything as big and complicated with so many pieces that seem vaguely alarming could possibly be a good thing for them. Their fears are stronger than their hopes.
What should be done?
I don't really have an answer for that. I mean, I'm not a political strategist and God knows I'm not a healthcare policy guy. I'm just noting that I think Obama lost the rhetorical ground over the past year. He was a great communicator during the campaign, but he turned to the thing he really loves most, which is deliberation. And deliberation did not win over the public. It slowly lost the public because it didn't seem to address them. It didn't seem to take note of their pain and their anger and their worry. And that's something Bill Clinton knew how to do very well. I think Obama is almost too high-minded for it, maybe too high-minded for his own good.
We have time for one last succinct question.
Okay, good. Thank you. I would love to hear, excuse me, your opinion on a comment I heard on public radio the other day. A speaker said that it would be very difficult for Obama to bring about any change because of a fossilized form of government.
Yeah, I think actually a colleague of mine at the New Yorker, Rick Hertzberg, writes about this a lot, that we need nothing short of a constitutional convention to break the cast that we're in now, which includes, as we all know now, the ability of senators representing 37% of the voting public to stop the senators representing the other 63% from doing anything. It does seem, but that's a Senate rule that the Senate itself could actually change. It's just that it's become calcified and sclerotic. The filibuster used to be an extreme measure used for, you know, bills that senators considered extreme. Now it's routine. But, you know, I'm a little suspicious of this feeling that suddenly our government is structured wrong, because it only seems to occur to people when they can't do what they want. If Obama were passing all his legislation, I doubt if his supporters would think that we need to, you know, to take one of Wyoming's senators and give it to California or something. I think more truly and more realistically, the power of money in Washington in both parties is huge. I was talking to a congressman who was describing how once the bankers come to Capitol Hill and start saying what they need, how terribly hard it is for anyone to be the guy to say, you're not getting it, and come and get me. And after this latest Supreme Court decision, it's going to be all the harder. So in a way, maybe the most important thing that will have happened in the year 2010 has already happened, and it was that decision, because it's going to reinforce what it has become maybe the single biggest obstacle to real legislative reform. Not the fact that Wyoming has 2 senators, but the fact that every state's senators get phone calls from their donors, and those donors now have so much power, and the public seems to not be organized in ways that can counter that power. That's another long-term factor. It used to be that there were other factions that at least could offer some kind of check against corporate money, and those are they're weaker than they used to be, and the corporations are stronger. So to me, that's the heart of the problem, and we've now, you know, been moved miles and miles farther away from a solution. And that was something Obama really wanted to do something about. I think the heart of Obama was not about jobs, and maybe not even about health care. The heart of Obama was about changing Washington. And it's why he spent months and months trying to have discussions with an opposition party that clearly had no intention of helping him, because he really thought he was the man who was going to bring us beyond the era of money in politics and of polarization. And instead, he now seems like the victim of it. So these are really powerful, long-term trends in our politics.
George Packer is one of our most influential and most important journalists. His new book, Interesting Times, Writings from a Turbulent Decade, is an important book. We will be offering it for sale, and George will be signing copies after the forum. And for those of you who are watching either on the web or on the some 50 different telecasts that our PBS friends do around the country, get it from your favorite bookseller, from a local store, or from one of the web-based stores. But in any case, get it. You need to read it. Thank you, George Packer.